academic figure drawing. So, yes, we all know what figure drawing is. We've all done it. We start very early in the process, in the program. Have you started with the little bar drawings and then proceed onwards with more complex until eventually we move into doing from the life model, and then from that again it progresses and it gets more complicated. But my goal for today is to broaden a little bit that knowledge, is to try to sort of delve into a little bit more the history of it, getting a little bit, just expanding more the knowledge of about figure drawing. What is exactly academic, and when you talk about academic figure drawing, and analyzing some works. Looking for some inspiration maybe for our own works later in the school. So yes, here's some examples of figure drawing. Again, analyzing, getting a little bit of inspiration for our own works, seeing what we can do more. So yes, academic figure drawing has deep history. It's live drawing. Again, it has traces its origin way back, and why is it so important actually? Okay, that's something that we're going to talk about. Yes, figure drawing, the importance of it comes from the analyzation of the human figure, the body, essentially of another human. Something that is very deep. I mean, we can think about it almost like the first drawings that were done by humans, let's say cave paintings, were of humans trying to represent another human in the sense of essentially showing an image of ourselves in a certain capacity. Later that evolved, and we tried to, with many different representations, getting closer and closer to the actual image, to the realistic image and the realistic representation of a human figure. That, of course, is not that easy, as many of us know. And why isn't it that easy, actually? Well, there is a lot of principles that come into play to produce a well-balanced and good-looking figure. So this is my idea for this presentation, to actually talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more about those principles and what goes into that. Why did it actually came about to be trying to get that in the academy? Why are we just not focusing on still lifes or on cats, but also trying to get the life model drawings? And more importantly, how did those people here in this image get to be so good? This is another thing that I've been wondering for a very long time. How did they get those 19th century folks being so prolific, being so good, being so such experts in greatness? After all, they are part of the reason that we inherit that tradition of figure drawing. They have they've set the cornerstone for what we're doing here now. So yeah, our academy traces its origins to those folks, to those people. The academic systems, the academic principles, they're set by these folks. Of course, they didn't come up with those. They inherited from as early as the Renaissance, and those people in the Renaissance, they even took it from people before them. It's just an upgrade as history progressed. And of course, we are just one step ahead of that. We're taking that and we're trying to implement it in the education system of 21st century figurism, 21st century art in general. So yeah, how did those people manage to produce something like this? Yeah, something as complex as this Louvre painting. A lot of complex elements. And how does figure drawing actually play into that? I mean, of course, this is painting, but where does these things fit into this, right? Like, how are they all connected? So we've all seen that some like drawings by masters. I think they actually maybe may have some soon after some slides. Some drawings by for example, Bouguereau or some other painters, and their drawings look down the preparation for these paintings don't look anything like the thing we do in class. But of course, we do it in class. That's the difference. They, for example, they've already went through this. They've already studied it, examined it, and the academic drawings we do here in the school, they're essentially they are training wheels, right? They are meant to be to just be the beginning, right? And essentially all the elements are a little bit exaggerated to squeeze more information out of it. To squeeze to every step is pronounced and exaggerated to show and teach each element that come together in this complex puzzle of painting, composition. But later these guys get to produce this kind of work. So figure drawing actually plays into this and fits in very, very well. After all, it's figure drawing is essentially painting, but with a dry medium. This is what we're doing. This is what we're teaching. It's you can manipulate it endlessly. It doesn't have a drying time. So yeah, that's how it all fits together. Yeah. So these people, right? Great masters. Jerome, Bouguereau, those great academicians. I'm going to mention a little bit about the academy in general. Quite interested in the works of these academicians, in what academicians even means, what is academicism. Okay, these topics are something that we are going to discuss a little bit as well today. So yeah, some really nice examples. Yeah, just looking, for example, at this figure. Look how graceful, how beautiful that is. Just each element of this could be painting on its own, but working together, it's even better. It's amazing to see. Also, looking at these guys over here, kind of fun. We had the audience. So yeah, academic. Let's try to explain what academic is. Why it's not just figure drawing. Well, figure drawing is a much broader term, and in that it's an umbrella term for anything, whether that's an educational study drawing, whether that's a finished drawing, whether that's an educational drawing done for educational purposes. It's just a broad term, and academic specifies for its educational purposes. It also stems from classical antiquity. Those principles that are entailed in the educational system are brought and collected from these ancient principles of whether that's balance or harmony, or proportions, canons of beauty. Those things taken from the classical antiquity are essentially trying to be taught. They are synthesized and exported as part of the educational system. Now, as you might have noticed, we're not producing here classical sculptures, right? We're not producing these classical, let's say, figures, right? They're not looking like sculptures or anything like this. They're more naturalistic, but everything fits together. And this is something that I'll try to explain today, how everything manages to collide and what bridges these two very distant worlds. So yes, I mentioned classical antiquity, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to start with a little bit of general history just to bring everyone up to speed. So classical antiquity, essentially, as I mentioned before, the people have tried to represent, in many different cultures, even before the Greeks, they have tried to represent essentially the human figure in different elements, right? For example, prior to the Greeks, the most common representation was a hyper-idealized version of the human figure. If we think of, for example, the Egyptians, all the sculptures were very stiff. They didn't possess any movement. Everything was hyper-symmetrical, and that sort of thing. Prior to this, it was even more abstract, we can say. Certain features were exaggerated to show a specific tendency. But how do you even transcend? How do you make it even more, let's say, godlike? How do you try to represent something that looks more divine than that? If you're trying to take, for example, the natural aspects, you might not get a good result. If it's a naturalistic portrait of someone, it's going to lose its godliness, right? Its godlike features. If it's too abstract, then it's too abstract. We can't relate to it really. It's nothing to relate. It doesn't strike any nerve in us. It's just it's there. So somewhere in between, it lays this element of that's divine. That's what it is, right? That's what transcends the human figure and transports it into something more divine, more heavenly, more So yes, so what did the Greeks do? So they took these elements of the abstraction of the figure, hyper-idealized figures, and they added an element of naturalism. They actually said, okay, let's take a model and try to abstract, well, not just one model, but many actually, and abstract take the features, extrapolate the features that are most common for everybody, for everyone. And when they collected those features and tried to extrapolate the essential qualities, it produced stuff like this, right? We can look at this and say, yes, it is divine because there isn't a person looking like this. But at the same time, we can recognize, this is a nose. It's very human nose. And these sides are very lifelike, and lips also. But at the same time, nobody looks like this. So they managed to combine these two aspects and find exactly that middle point of the ideal and the natural. And they managed to combine them to produce a classical, to produce a idealized version of a human. So of course, moving from there, it's not just for the portrait, but it's also for the human body. Same idea. Stuff are left out, and just the essential qualities are brought in. But still enough to make it look like a human, yet transcend these qualities. So this is what makes classical sculptures look like this, right? There is an element of restfulness, an element of tranquility that we find in these. There's nothing too strenuous, nothing too, an element of exertion, right? Everything is very heavenly, right? That is the idea that they're actually represent. So yes, from the Greeks, that tradition that they founded in classical antiquity, as we call it now, which was around the 4th century BC. Moving from there, that tradition was a little bit lost. As the Greek Empire with the Macedonians grew, part of the element of empires is collecting elements of different cultures, so it kind of got washed away. But some elements were preserved and even elevated on a pedestal by the Romans. So the Romans most of the Greek sculptures actually, they kind of survived because the Romans copied them. If not, they did some restoration work. They would fix an arm, they would fix this, that, and most of the Greek sculptures that we recognize today are just copies of the copies that the Romans did. Moreover, it's that most of these sculptures are actually just taken. The classical pose is taken from the Greeks. So this is how this element was transported a little bit further. Moving from there, what happened with the collapse of the Roman Empire was that was lost again. And during the Middle Ages, there was not an element. Also, by the way, there was no need for this. Religion at the time, I cannot speak too much about it. Not that too familiar more about that, but essentially there was no need in having such idealized figures. Religion was more, let's say, internal at the time. So also the tradition with, of course, with the collapse of empire, there is loss of knowledge in most cases. So how did Michelangelo produce something so classical as this David? Well, most of the things that the Romans did preserve, like philosophy, for example, it got preserved till the last moment in Constantinople. And Constantinople in 1453, it got captured by the Ottomans. So that was long overdue. The Byzantine Empire had shrunken massively to the point where Constantinople was the only remnant of the Romans, or Eastern Roman Empire, and that was almost like that for a century or so. So it was long overdue. They knew that it's going to collapse at some point. So kind of that information that was preserved on scrolls, in archives in Constantinople, they exported it to Italy, the last moment. And all that information came to Italy, and the Italians started translating those works, looking at them. They were like, oh, this is important kind of thing. Let's figure out what that is to begin with. So let's translate it. Let's preserve it. So maybe share it. And all of a sudden, there was a newfound interest in the classical, in the old, in these philosophies of the past, kind of thing. So during the Renaissance, Renaissance means the rebirth of stuff. It's the rebirth of that classical thought, of this classical culture, and that's happened simply because Constantinople collapsed. So this is what happened. These ideas influenced. They went through, let's say, those translators into the popular culture and into the artists. The artists started manifesting it into their own works. And so, of course, Michelangelo produced the David. A century later, Bernini produced his David. Now, this is a little bit more different than this one. The essential difference being that this isn't captured in a moment of tranquility, right? This is in a moment of rest. Something very particular to the classical sculptures. They, by the way, had access to classical sculptures. Not like they were hidden away from the people in the Renaissance. However, they didn't have interest in them. The Renaissance essentially revived that interest in those classical sculptures, and they started analyzing and studying them deeper. So the David essentially represents a point of tranquility that is usual quality in the classical sculptures. And by the way, that is also what they're trying to capture with our models. We're not trying to capture them in one specific moment, but it's kind of like in this relaxed state that they're holding. That's also the analysis of prolonged figures, right? We're trying to capture a model in a restful state that it happens over the course of their pose. While if you think something more incidental or an element of, or you're trying to produce an element of movement, you get this. You get Baroque, essentially. Baroque intensifying these movements, these sharp, like getting, for example, the strain of the muscles and an athlete pushed and that sort of thing. To produce something as lively as these Baroque sculptures. So yes, Bernini produced this, and Bernini is not accidental. I'm not putting Bernini there just for random. He was partly the reason that the French Academy was established in the first place. So what he did was, he was so good at his time. He was a son of another sculptor. He was so good at the time that he captured the attention of other nations. So he, as an adolescent, he got as a patron this. I think he was a pastor or something like this, who later became a pope. And that pope gave Bernini basically commissions for everything. And Bernini was not simply a sculptor, but he was also a painter. And not only that, he was also an architect. And not only that, he was also a theater decor designer. And not only that, he was a parade organizer. He was everything, everything that you could ask for. So he actually, in pseudoscientist sort of thing also, he experimented a lot with like pyrodynamics and that sort of thing. So yes, he was everything. So the Pope gave him commissions for everything, literally, finishing the St. Peter, yes, to building many other churches in Rome, to building many palaces in Rome, fountains, piazzas, and everything. And he essentially, that's why they call him the builder of Rome. He built Rome as we know it today, to a very large extent. He did a lot of things. And he had a massive atelier. He was training a lot of students in doing this. He was meaning like a mastermind behind everything. He didn't do much himself. He was more like giving orders to people. But so much so that the French, looking at how he was building Rome, said, "Why don't we have this here in France, in Paris?" And under the commission of Louis XIV, they established the French Academy in Paris. And actually, part of the education in the academy was that when you graduate, you get a scholarship to go to Rome, right? The Prix de Rome, the prize of Rome, essentially. You get to go there and steal the craft from these guys, right? The guys that were building Rome. You steal that and you bring it back to France. So yes, Bernini, another incidental figure. There, of course, after a couple of centuries, what happened was that interest, let's say, the Baroque and intensified. There was sort of like a moment of, there was after the Baroque, there was the Rococo for a very short period of time. But there's something changed, right? The Enlightenment in the 18th century was essentially, well, the 18th century gave birth to the Enlightenment. And during that time, they actually discovered Pompeii. And Pompeii was this sort of, imagine like a mythical city. They didn't really know, they hadn't found it yet. And nowadays we don't really see the importance of Pompeii as a cultural phenomenon, but back then when they discovered it, it was preserved so well that they finally got a glimpse into the classical world. So many artists were commissioned, but also voluntarily, they went to Pompeii to study it, to study the classical sculptures, study the ornamentation, the architecture, and everything they could essentially get their hands on in Pompeii, almost like an archaeological work, documenting everything. So what does Canova have to do with this? Well, that gave birth to neoclassicism. Essentially the rediscovery of Pompeii gave another, it revived another interest once more, revived the interest once more in this classical period, the classical antiquity. So Canova essentially, again, prime example of neoclassicism. Again, we find from the Baroque, moving away from the Baroque, we find this element of tranquility in the poses. Very pushed, nobody can turn their neck that much. This pose, by the way, is this sculpture, by the way, is in Pitti. You can go look at it. Try to turn your neck like this, you wouldn't be able to. It's an element of pushing nature, but again, it's more about the harmony of everything, the capturing of that tranquility, and an element of, once again, transcendence. if I can very quickly just compare it with the Bernini, this we can relate more to it than, let's say, this one. This is very distant, a little bit more distant than the Bernini one. So yes, this is what the one liter revival to the classical resulted in. But this is sculpture. I'll show you sculpture mainly because the antiques we can have access to because of this sculpture. So stone is way more permanent than the painting. So that's why we were comparing sculptures until now. But now let's see how neoclassicism looks in painting, like this. Not very. It's not very powerful, is it? And this is very typical of neoclassicism. It looks almost like a frieze, like a Greek frieze. This is another thing that is already in Pompeii, kind of thing, similar to this. This is probably not from there, but it's a frieze, right? Everything is sort of similar, symmetrical kind. We see it almost like on a stage of a theater. While this. Yeah, and this is very similar to that, right? They're kind of similar, right? And it's almost like on a stage. And yeah, that was what was fashionable at the time, neoclassicism. Imagine this is like the end of the 18th century and just the turn of the 19th century. So yeah, this is neoclassicism. But this is not like those great academicians. If we compare this to Bouguereau, looks nothing like it. It's much different. And this also I'll show later. But this also reflects in the students' works, and we'll see where our works fit into this as well. But yes, we're already in this element. This is already we're already in the academy, let's say. This is produced in the academy. This is for Prix de Rome, the one, and the scholarship to go to Rome. So this is the work that the judges thought saw the potential in Ang. So he did this and went to Rome. Still good painting, although it doesn't have that element of it's a little stiff, let's say, a little dry. So yeah, we saw this. So later something happened, right? So later, how do we get from these stiff neoclassical sculptures to these this 1920, but this gets its tradition from mid-19th century style. Where do we get this sort of very beautiful and graceful and nice sculptures, right? With a lot of emotion, a lot of very sensual as well. Where do we get that from? And how did we get there? Well, there was, just to analyze this a little bit, again, just notice how it has a little bit more naturalistic elements into it than, let's say, the neoclassical stuff. So it's a little bit more naturalistic, but at the same time, very transcendent, very idealized in certainly some aspects. Right, of course, nobody's a satyr, so that's the first. Well, but also looking at these features, this is again very idealized. But again, for example, looking at this area, this is a little more naturalistic than the depiction done in neoclassical style. So yeah, again, the 19th century saw some movement towards naturalistic tendencies. It also saw the birth of realism, which until then was not really a thing. So the 19th century saw the birth of realism, and realism was implemented and combined with the academic classical style. And the result being these really beautiful units. So essentially what I'm trying to get to is another example. What I'm trying to get to is the 19th century, what they managed to do is they managed to combine the natural and the neoclassical together. They took the elements of the transcendent from the neoclassical and the classical, and they managed to squeeze into that and put some naturalistic aspects into it. Essentially getting closer to classical antiquity or the principles set by the Greeks in the classical antiquity, combining that the natural and the classical and the transcendent to a point that hits just the right spot, let's say, to create something as beautiful as this, right? So most of you know me. I enjoy quite a lot of 19th century works, particularly because of this reason, because they managed to combine these two words in a very specific tone, in a very specific resonance that just exactly tickles the right part of the brain, right? So another example, another sculpture, but yes, very tranquil nature, but still quite a lot of emotion. So yes, this is how it looks in paintings and not with sculpture, but paintings and drawings. So this is a drawing by Bogorov, or one of his paintings. Again, we see how similar these are, right? Still quite classical, but at the same time with elements of naturalistic elements. And we can see how from that we can produce a work like this. Now, it's more, here more curious is the thought that produced this rather than the technical aspect. Because to talk about the technique of producing something like this is a completely different topic. Or the thought is what I'm trying to get to is what was the sensibility that managed to produce something as marvelous as this? And that is exactly what it was. It had to still transcend, but also had to relate to us just enough to produce something as beautiful as this. So, but something else happened. At the same time, with the neoclassicism, there was another movement. This is a very, not very old debate. It was just a debate that was a century or two earlier than the 1800s. That was the debate, which was more prevalent, which was more important, line or color. And that debate didn't got resolved in 2 centuries. To these guys, it didn't get away, didn't get lost, that debate. Essentially, the arguments were followers of Poussin. And I'm probably mispronouncing that. They believed that line was more important. They believed that line was essentially it appealed more to the intellect. It's kind of like the design aspect. It's more about you coming up with it. So it's more intellectual, let's say. So it's more rational in a certain aspect. However, the followers of Rubens believed that color was more important because it appealed to the emotions of people. So you look at a painting, you see the colors, and it appeals to your emotions. That's what they thought. Another difference is the followers of Rubens, the ones who believed that color was more important, they also took a lot of inspiration from nature. While the ones who were inspired by Poussin and the line, they took inspiration entirely from classical antiquity. So what happened was the classicists inherited that tradition of line, and the romantics, they inherited the tradition of color. So essentially we got line versus color in 2 completely different movements happening at the same time. So it's something like it's intensifying, right? It's just that debate is just showing itself with paintings. So you can see the 2 differences, very, very distinct. So essentially the point I was trying to make was what happened with these two movements was that they had such an impact on the art world that the academicians that followed these 2 movements that were born during the time of these 2 being at their peaks, most of these people became academicians. Most of these artists became academicians. After all, Ang and Delacroix, they were both They had both atelier, they had students, and they taught many of them. They and that gave essentially rise to these new academicians that were teaching in the academies later. And the 19th century sought to combine these two movements. And the academicians probably came closest to combining the two, to getting the appeal of essentially the combining line and color, getting the intellectual aspect of precision of the line with the appeal to the emotions of the color. So people like Bouguereau, like Cabanel, like Ari Scheffer, many other academicians, or rather people, painters who painted in the academic style, they managed to produce, managed to get as close as possible to merging these two worlds. In other words, getting as close as possible to this beginning, this sort of classical antiquity, the desire to transcend via the line, but also appeal to the emotions and the natural. So let's see a quick graph just to give us another aspect of what we were discussing. So this was kind of the era of Bernis, so when the academy was established. Over the course of this, into the French Revolution, we observe like the Baroque mostly here, and then we get the Rococo until the French Revolution, which sought to essentially secularize a little bit more society. Well, of course, we have here a little bit more, we have the Enlightenment also starting to play a part. Academic drawing that I'm going to be discussing mainly is this period, although focusing mainly in this period and even more precisely around here, to get a notion of what I'm talking about. So like between the 63 and sort of like the 1880s to the 1900s. So if just a quick history of the French Academy is after the First World War, a lot of things changed in society to begin with. There was a lot of, well, many societal barriers and classes of society broke down. Things were such as the academy, like these institutions were believed to be sort of a thing of the bourgeois. So yeah, a lot of things changed in society. And let's say the academy continued just to break down and into different parts, and just the standard started dropping down until it became disillusionment in the 1960s, when there was a big rebellion of all the students, and they broke castes and they destroyed stuff, and the academy just was not the same. It still exists until nowadays, but it's just completely not the same thing. Yeah, and the academicism that I was talking earlier is roughly about this period, the 1820s to the 1900s. So now we get to the importance of the academy. So I can see are we already time? Okay. So the academy. The two images you see here, this is the courtyard of the academy. The academy, the structure, we'll touch on a little bit on that. The academy was established, it was more like a painter's club kind of thing, where in order to enter the academy, you already had to be quite good. You had to enter with a painting that you've done. It's like, oh yeah, that's good. You're good enough to enter in the academy. Which later evolved, just like, I mean, it's a 17th century thing in the beginning. Later, as society evolved, there was, of course, the Industrial Revolution. Education changed to a certain degree, and society evolved to a certain extent until we get to the 19th century. So we are getting into the age of more systemic and systemized type of learning, of education, such as schools, for example. Those were born. The idea was school in modern capacity, in modern sense, was born in the 19th century. So the academy. This is the latest. This is the latest. It was its look. So now this still exists. This is what's left of it, the so-called courtyard. But before it was filled with sculptures, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So yes, this is what the normal atelier looked like in the academy. Just to give you a notion, give you an idea of what the academy was essentially a drawing school. It wasn't a painting school, it was a drawing school. You entered in the academy, you applied for it, you entered, education was free, and you got, you had to enter with, what do you call that, the letter of recommendation. So you entered there, and you essentially, you already were kind of good to begin with in order to get your letter of recommendation, but once you entered, you go through a drawing casts and drawing, literally just drawing casts. After this, you were given the choice of choosing a painter, an academician, to study with. Give an example, Jerome, another one, Cabanel, or such and such. You choose that and you enter their atelier. So that's already outside of the main building of the academy, and it's outside of that. It's a separate building somewhere else of the painter's choosing. So you enter their atelier and you study with other students. The instructor did come in twice a week, something like this, to give a note. But most of the time, the students were left to their own to their own needs. So this is what it looked like. The academy. So we kind of see some easels. By the way, this is Cabanel's atelier. This is Cabanel giving a demo to some students here on the easels. There was a clear hierarchy. The easels only the painting students. If you're drawing, if you're just coming in, you're like this guy sitting on a chair in front of you. On another chair is your board with drawing. By the way, not a side-size thing inside. Everything is completely comparative. These guys are not even on easel, so it's not even next to it. And everything is just hyper, like everything is just cramped. So these guys are, you see some, I think I have an example of that one, but they will even cut the legs even shorter to even sit even closer on the ground, so the guys behind them are a little bit taller so they can see a little more. So it was packed, these studios were packed. And you pray that when you decide to enter in that atelier, they have space for you. Otherwise, it's hard. So this is an example. Bouguereau's atelier in Julian. Bouguereau wasn't, he applied many times to become an academician. A royal academician. Later, the academician affiliated with the Institut de France. So meaning, subsidized by the government. He didn't get the spot, but later when Julian established his sort of like private school kind of thing, Julian asked Bouguereau to teach there. And it was a good opportunity for Bouguereau, and people went there to study. I guess mostly foreigners who didn't manage to get into the École des Beaux-Arts, into the French Academy, proper French academies in the music world. So, okay, let's look at the drawing. So I talked a little bit, a lot, I guess. Talked about the history of art in general. Let's see how drawing fits into this, and more importantly, how the drawings done in the academy in educational circumstances. So in the 18th century, this is how a drawing often looked like. It's again, we see how it correlates with the paintings at the time. This is very what I call Rococo style, and it's kind of like when there is not much form. It's very naturalistic in its aspect. It's very pushed. It's looking for those muscles and whatnot, trying to find a still good balance, but looking for more stuff, looking for as many things as possible, but still organizing them in a very good system, nice to look at in there. For there's no sense of tonal drawing at all. It's just about eyeing the line and looking for those things. Moving into the turn of the century, around the 1800s, This is what a drawing looked like, very inspired from the neoclassical. It looks like a sculpture, very, very strong, very architectural. Everything is super symmetric, super geometric in a sense. And this is what a neoclassical sculpture looked like. By the way, these guys, as they're drawing them, they're already turning them into gods in a certain aspect. Right? They're trying to perceive the model as a god and draw it in that pose. Not much naturalism creeping into this yet. Later, we get something like this, and this was more like the middle of the 19th century, more naturalism. Right? More naturalism, more already looking at the model, looking for already these, like hair. Right? Like if we look at these guys, where is hair on his head and a little bit here suggested, but just their bodies are like polished like marble. But these ones already starting to have some ideas, some notion of naturalistic tendencies with the pose, with the model. It's already not like God. It's this is kind of like thin person, not very muscular. But later, at the turn of the century, you see a lot of this, a lot of backgrounds, a lot of showing this like contrast and looking for more like what I call like photographic kind of effect, right? Two-dimensional, very sheet-based design aspect to it. Still a very clear design of the line, more tonally, worked more tonally. If you compare this to, let's say, this one, the tones here are very suggestive, right? Like it's just, it's a background, but this is here is the background, right? It's like contrasted with the figure to the exact point. So this is what the late 19th century or like the second half of the 19th century drawings looked like. And this was not exclusive, by the way, to the French. The Russians, they also had the same progression. These are drawings done in the Russian Academy. Same thing. 18th century, same thing. If I just took those two and didn't tell you which one is which, you wouldn't guess the difference, right? This one, again, is still very well organized, still very idealized, but then you see, a lot of information, everything is, of course, a lot of forms showing still, a lot of forms and whatnot, bumps and whatnot. Again, background very suggestive, just to show some contrast with the figure. But yet again, it's typical 18th century drawing. Moving into the 19th century, we see neoclassicism and how it looked like in Russia. Very, very sculptural, very symmetrical, very architectural. Everything's geometrical and straight lined and stiff and strong in structure. In a sense that these aspects that I was talking earlier with the sculptures are now showing. This is looking like a rendition of a sculpture, also with another person, in other words. And moving from that into the late 19th century, we see again more naturalism. The guy probably looks the same as the model. Now, there are some aspects of organization, such as, like, for example, these beautiful knees, by the way, they do not seem like, maybe the model did have these beautiful knees, but they seem very much like conceptualized to a certain degree. Yet, we see a lot more naturalistic aspects. There's some subcutaneous, there's some level of organization, but yeah, more naturalistic. But then there is the, so yes, but why is this, right? Why did this progression happen with the Russian Academy? Then now the question would be, well, why the two, right? Why are we talking about the French Academy and the Russian Academy? Because their influences of the two is the biggest on the art world today, right? We either talk about the Academy or the academic style of the French or the Russians. So yes, that's what I'm talking about. The two. Not to say that the Spanish did not have their own. Not to say that the Italians did not have their own academies. After all, the first academies were here here in Florence, actually, under the commission of Cosimo I. So first academy in the world here in Florence. But the big academies were outside of Italy, and those are the ones I'm talking about right now. So the Russian Academy. So yes, it established kind of like a century and 20 years later than the French Academy. And Catherine the Great, she sought to bring a lot of that French influence into Russia. Russia was building, it was becoming an empire. Catherine the Great was getting new territories. The empire was growing. They conquered Siberia. They went all the way down to the Black Sea. A lot of stuff, right? It's a growing empire. A lot of money is flowing into the empire, and they're trying to import now some art. They had to essentially too. That was what was fashionable at the time, the French art. So what Catherine the Great did was she invested a lot of money buying a lot of art from France, and not only that, she paid a lot of artists to come into Russia to teach. So a lot of French influence flowed into Russia. The academy was modeled after the French Academy. So she invested, in the early years of the academy, she invested a lot of money. She did in the Imperial Building, which is now the one in St. Petersburg, that big, magnificent building. She commissioned it for the academy that still stands today. So in the early years of the academy, very, very strong French influence, as we saw earlier, almost indistinguishable from the French drawings we saw earlier. So very, very French were Russians at the time. Of course, later, what I have called, I don't know how to call it, probably realist Russian painters, who gave the proper name, came into, let's say, it was kind of like, as realism grew into just everywhere, spark. Again, a product probably of the Enlightenment movement. The realists, they were trying to get a hold of the institutional art, what they call the official art at the time. Not just in Russia, but everywhere. It's called the official art, the one sponsored by the government. So they were trying to get a strain a little bit and fight for their own rights, for their own, I'd say, to get essentially a name for themselves, right? Change a little bit the academy also to allow this to be taught to new students. And in this period of Great Russian painting is where we know like people like Kramskoy, people like Repin, people like all these big names, all these big Russian names. It's in that period they were actually against the official academy. So those guys, they managed to reform, initiate the reform in the academy to such extent that they actually gave later the academy's named after one of those guys he was elected. Later, what happened was with the October Revolution, the socialists coming into power, they banned the academy. They said no longer. This is very aristocratic. Later was institutionalized somewhere in the 30s, and finally in 47 was moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And now what stays in St. Petersburg is just an academy, let's say. Still, I believe, government subsidized, but it's a different academy. It's not the official Russian academy. It's now in Moscow. So yeah, so this is just an overview of this the timeline. But yeah, so you can see how this progressed and moved out of that. So we have this very typical for Europe drawings of the time. But there we are seeing these productions. Both of these, I think, are done in the last 10 or 15 years. But I believe them to be a good representation of what art was in the 20th century as well, but also the 21st century. So you see a different thought was developing there. They believe more in the knowledge that was required for building up a figure, essentially, almost like if you're sculpting the figure, but with the information that you know rather than that you observe. More like imagine probably the best explanation that I've heard is that the Europeans at the time and the way we work now, it's more like we see the thing because it's illuminated from the light source. It has specific shapes, it has specific information, and we gather that information and we represent it. While they thought, okay, but what happens when you flip the lights off, right? What's there? What are you going to represent now? You don't know anything without the light. So they thought that it was more important to know and understand the structure of things so you can show it even if you don't have the light there. So this difference of thought, although to a certain degree these things collide together, merge together very well, they gel together very well, produced a different result essentially. It had different influence over the course of the century.
So yeah, this gives you a nice overview of the Russian Academy.
Let's go back to the French and talk about their academic system. But I think this is a good time. I would actually call a little bit of a break, a small 5 to 10 minutes break. Let's say 10 minutes, and be back in 15 minutes to
Took it. It was already in place. They just systemized it,
and as the centuries progressed,
it became more systemic and more integrated
into a curriculum of education. So let's see how it looks. So the academic system always begins with some level of study of the antiquity. In other words, study of casts and sculptures. So as an example, I'm giving this guy from before, and this is of course a bar drawing. It's a replication of this one. So this, yes, you begin with, always, by studying the antique. Another place where you study the antique is with the bark plates. I'll talk about them in a little bit. But first, just in general, you study antique. This is the main point that I'm trying to make. You study the classical to begin with. You study how to idealize. You study how to create the illusion of form using the antiques. It's already been rendered. It's already been made. It's already been conceptualized, gone through the mind of an artist. So it's already simplified. It's easier, but also it's complex in its nature that we have to make it right. We have to study it. We have to analyze it. So a certain level of studying the antique. So in this particular case, the past. So this is what a kind of drawing used to look like. So this drawing done by Kenyon Cox, study of student of Jerome, and this is the drawing that documented the figure room. So it was not like you have to do a set number of drawings and then progress. It was you do the drawings until you're good enough to enter the figure room. So it's a bit more different. But then it required a lot of study, a lot of analyzation, and see. Yes, so this is the one that got him in. This is the one where Jerome said, "Oh, you're good enough. Enter in my studio." This is where it was done. It was done in the occult's courtyard. So a student would just simply pull a chair. This is good. So the student would simply pull a chair and another chair, put their drawing and a. I should misspell this, by the way, so don't ignore it. But what's that?
Jerome in Bulgarian.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the student would pull out a chair and just sit in front of a class. They're drawing it. You'll just start drawing. You'll just start start drawing. Yeah. Same thing as in figure. You just pull forward and you just look at it and you just draw. As simple as this. Of course, we all know that it's not that simple. So this is how it was done in the academy. They had many things. They had such as these vases, horses, different sculptures for classical Renaissance. They had different pediments to study columns, order, like the capitals. Just many different things to study.
and just give him quite a lot of choice, and then yes, they will do that. So yes, this we saw. Here's Jerome giving a critique to a student. He always sit down, and the student will just observe very carefully what he was saying.
Where's he from?
Yes, it's coming. So yes, this is one of course student struggles. This is one of Kenny Carter's first drawings. Those are spectacular. Certainly had room for improvement. We both know that this one is inside of the bar place. So of course, he started drawing it. You can see some very close lines. He marked it in. We see kind of like the awkward position it's in on the paper. So yeah, it's probably discontinued at some point. It was not that good to begin with. It was like, okay, might as well just start one all over. But after some time, of course, he managed to get better. So this is the progression of this painter in class. So yes, after some time, he did get lots better. Notice there was a sculpture, very good. Everything is working marvelously. Nothing stands out as being wrong. Notice the soft shadows. Notice the half of the transition. Everything is just nice. It's worth it. Yeah, it's simply beautiful. Of course, it was this one that brought him into the room, into the figure. By the way, just to make a quick note of this, the bars that we see, these ones, initially they look like this, most likely. They look like a CAS drawing, a normal CAS drawing that the student would produce. What Jerome did was, in his efforts to systemize this and educate the students, even before they entered into the academy, was to essentially he took the best drawings that his students had produced, and he commissioned that they would be made into these widely distributed lithographs. And so they took, for example, a drawing like this, and Charles Bard had to make it into something like this. So most likely they had this sculpture in the courtyard. The student had drawn it, and later it became a bar. So I'm just giving you an option about how these bars came about. I'm going to talk more about the issue of the Melodina. So we went over this. Kind of like full attempt. This is a good attempt. Finally, Kenny Cox was approved to enter in the figure where he started drawing. Like starting. Maybe this is in the beginning of his education. You can kind of see it's kind of good. It's getting there. Still a lot to learn. It's a little awkward in some aspects. It's a little bit like, what's he doing? Like there's not really a movement. It's a little bit stiff. It's a little bit unbalanced. There's something going on. It's not that good. But after some time, of course, he progressed, managed to get quite good. And we can see this figure being a good example of that. By the way, this figure was executed in the evening drawing classes. So I mentioned that the French Academy was a drawing academy, let's say, where they would draw. Now, after you've done your CAS drawings, you were approved to enter in the atelier of a teacher, an instructor, where you would continue your study from the live model. However, in addition to that, the academy also had evening classes. Evening classes because they were not with natural light; they were with gas lamps. Now, in those evening classes, it was very, very hard to enter. The available spots were something like, I believe, between 70 and 100. So you had to compete to enter. And every 6 months, you have to compete again to keep your spot in those evening classes. So this was those evening, here. This is what those evening classes used to look like. So gas lamps to illuminate the works of the students. They was in an auditorium.
So you had basically a stick that you use to rest it on the back of the board, and then the bottom is your knees, and you see on top the illuminated cast or figure for that fact, depending. Now, another thing that I didn't mention that I'm particularly amazed by is they had a week for these things. So figures, casts, they had a week for them. So they have to be fairly quick. A week, of course, 6 days. They had Sunday off. They didn't have Saturday and Sunday off. So they had a week to draw, for example, this cast. But Kenyon Cox, of course, so this was done in those evening classes. Actually, I believe he wrote a letter to his mom thinking about how bad an angle he got for this particular pose. But of course, Kenyon Cox, after he left the academy, of course, he learned these, he mastered them. He became a master of lines. I'm amazed by these drawings because they're so good. They're just amazing. Like the sensitivity in them is just fabulous. The overlaps, the design of the line, but also tone themes, and just everything's just beautiful. He got commissioned, I believe, to paint something. He was American. He studied with Jerome, and when he went back to America, he got commissioned to paint, I believe, a mural painting in the library or something like this. And I believe these ones are for that place. And yeah, it's it became really good. This being another example. Look how amazing that looks. Just that it looks like a sculpture. Maybe if it very well designed. It's perfectly balanced that aspect between the actual idea lines. Actually, kind of curious where he got that from, because in the academy he was supposed to draw like this. Still, with some level of classical principle and sensibility. Yes, you were expected to make it a little bit more naturalistic. You were expected to make this guy look like that and not like Zeus, right? So yes, he managed to get to this level where he would manage to draw his model, still transforming it into Hermes. So this is just, it's kind of wonderful that he managed to produce this at I believe late 19th century or just after the turn of the century. Kind of really nice to see. So this is what came out of him. So this is what the evening drawing classes used to look like. And the evening drawing classes were led by Adolphe Yvon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Adolphe Yvon, but he was the main instructor for about 20 years or so. He also produced a book that we're actually gonna go through in a little bit. Adolphe Yvon, yes, he was the main drawing instructor there, and he would teach those evening classes. Yes, that's the main thing. So, evening drawing classes. Those are very important. You had to compete to enter. You had to compete every 6 months to get to keep your spot. Also, you have to compete for a good spot. So if you enter one of the first, you get the good spots. If you're the lowest, you get the bad spots. So it's kind of like very competitive to get in. Once you're in, that opens you up for room for other competitions to enter in some small, essentially to enter into other additional classes such as perspective, such as anatomy, such as composition, I believe, too, later in the academy. And once you've done all of these, they also had something called the emotions, essentially where a model would pose, and they have to change the facial features to make it into an emotion they would do for the tape. So that was another course that they had to do, and had to compete in that to get a good spot. Essentially, all these little competitions here and there open the room for you to elevate your status in the academy, with which later you'd be allowed to even enter in the Prix de Rome to begin with. Now, you might say, well, what is the importance of the Prix de Rome? Is it necessary? Well, it's kind of necessary because with the Prix de Rome, it's actually essentially your graduation. It's how you graduated from the academy, and your career is guaranteed. Essentially, your career is set. You're off to a good path. So you compete for the pre-Rome, you enter, and you're off to Rome for 3 years. Government subsidized, government pays you everything. You just the necessity was that once you're in Rome, you have to they give you some from like a week once a year. They give you something to copy. Let's say, oh, copy Donatello's thing in this church, this fresco, make it into a canvas, ship it to France. That's what's your requirement. If not, they can cut your stay back to France. You're not good anymore.
So they were going to school. They were coming to just copy that.
Exactly, yeah. Continuing their studies, copy, being wrong, look at the masters at work. They did not have really, they had some figure stuff, but mostly they were just like working on their composition, studying, the whole bunch of traveling Italy, coming to Florence, going down to Pompeii, stuff like this while they're in Rome. Yes, and also the Villa Medici, where the French Academy in Rome was, Villa Medici, was also like like an embassy sort of thing for France. So every time an important person came through that embassy, they were like, okay, you paid that person a portrait. So it was like kind of like that thing. So yes, a lot of work. You have to paint. You have to you just professional on it. So anyway, this was just a little bit of the course talking about the Rome. Anyway, that's the importance of the evening drug classes. Open your the wing for opportunities. It was very hard to enter. The people who didn't enter, they just kind of quit the academy also, and kind of like rebelled against it. Well, they did other things, right? They became the impressionists, and that's what they did. Sorry, Antoine. So yes. Anyway, the academy. This is another thing. The academy was free for you, but if you produced a good drawing, the academy stamped it several times and it's like, now it's ours, and they kept it. So this drawing is actually out of the archives in the École des Arts in France, in Paris. So it's still there, by the way. So this one is out of the archives. That's why it is with matte and framed and everything. This one won an award. By the way, this is the same pose as this one. It's from the same day, it's from the same week. So it's kind of amazing. So obviously, Kenny Fox didn't win anything that week. It was it's this guy, Gustav Surand, that won the praises of the judges or the teacher. Enough so that they stole their drawing. Anyway, yeah, we can see it's kind of it's really nice drawing. We can see some close-ups. Look at the face. It's amazing. From up close, it's like very abstract, very soft. Everything is amazing to look at. Just like some accents here for the eye, for the nostril. Get that beard a little bit. Pulls this out. Cheating coming out of this. It's just everything is amazing. Looking at the torso, again, same thing. Very, very soft, just with some accents here and there, allowing for that nice contrast. Again, very strong outline. Also notice how the outline goes like darker with close to turn, the font's turning. So really, really nice academic drawing. That was what the academic drawing was all about. We're using these ones. Also sets the larger font. So this report was like this one. It's turning. Everything's turning nice and well. So yes, good drawing, good stuff. Looking at the feet, again, very, very nice here. I think you don't get enough time to render completely, but we can see that it's also very, very nice. Looking in comparison with the big thing, you don't even notice that it's not rendered. But coming closer, we can see that's how loose it is, and just added just enough to look like a foot. It's quite nice. With the outline, it's even more attractive. Just call over with an outline. That's it. But still got the praises of the judges. So it's pretty nice. So yes, cool things. They also did casts, as I mentioned earlier. This is a cast drawing that they produced again in a week, by the way.
So this was Henrique Postal, I think is. I believe he was a Portuguese student of Cabanel. He was a student of Cabanel attending the evening drawing classes. So during the morning, he was in Cabanel studio. He was drawing figures. In the evening, he was drawing figures and casts. So he basically produced, in essence, 2 figures a week. So that's over the course of the entire year. So that's a lot of figures to produce. Some good, some bad. We're kind of looking, that's another thing, we're kind of looking at the good ones, because those are the ones that survive. If you're actually interested to see some bad drawings, go to eBay and just look at French academic drawings or something like this, or drawings they call something like this. There's a lot of bad stuff that shows up, people that are aesthetics on those drawings. Sometimes there's good stuff, and you can find a drawing that's about 100 to 200 euros, so those are good. I believe Jared has some of those. No surprise. But yeah, that's pretty good. So yes, these are some really nice ones. Again, a stamp, probably won an award or something. But yes, again, very, very nice, very, very soft editing. Look nice. It looks like a cast, right? So yeah, good things. Now let's talk a little bit about the courses. I'll talk a little bit about the art course. We'll talk about Julienne, not the same Julienne as the Julienne Academy, a different Julienne. And the book by Adolphe Vivant. I'm going to talk about these 3 because they're probably one of the most influential at the time, and also the art course is so influential, we still use it today. So it's not good to know about it. To appreciate their importance, let's say. So, the bar, I'm going to begin with the bar because it's the most familiar one. The bar course. We all know how it looks, but we don't know how it starts. The bar course began, also the Julienne, it was a response, it was out of necessity to produce these. During the 1860s, I believe exactly 1860, there was an exhibition, a student exhibition of, let's say, schools and students from across the country. Students like before, not how you say, not in the academy, not under supervision, say, like under the institutional supervision, but more like local stuff, right? Those were submitted for that exhibition. The critics and the people who went to that exhibition were so appalled by what they saw. They were like, these kids do not know how to draw. We need to make it possible that they learn how to draw. So we need to produce something that they copy to learn. So that's how the bar course kind of began. It's as a response. Also the Julienne. Both of these were produced exactly, I think, a few months of each other. And it was all about distributing these packs of lithographs, and they were grouped together in different groups. If you look at also the book, it's also like, first step or second step, something like this, like chapters. And so you can buy kind of like that pack, and you can take it home and copy it to learn. They were distributed. The ones that are hanging there are like regional ones. Later, after they stopped producing, they got destroyed, most of them, over the amount of use, over the amount of use, and most of them just remained hanging in frames, or just preserved. If they're not used, that's how they're got to be in our academy today. We're using the book to produce our copies, to reproduce the drawings. So yes, that's how this course began, out of necessity. We thought it was necessary for students to learn how to draw, because they saw it is important. It was amazing how actually involved the government was in doing these things, right? Actually, the bar course, I believe in 1900 or just before 1900, it was approved by the U.S. government to be used in schools as learning as part of the curriculum, essentially. In schools, in high schools. So,
How does the bar course begin? It begins by studying constructs, as we call it today, or just like how to construct basic shapes, how to break down something complex into something simple. But notice it's everything out of the antique, right? This study, the intense study of the antique that I was talking earlier, it's in the bar course. There is nothing real or natural or like a photograph in the bar course. It's all reproductions of the antique. So you start studying how to draw by copying the antique. It was so important. It was so embedded in the academic system. So you start studying these eyes and that you start copying, right? You learn how to break it down from this angle, from this angle, from this angle. Another thing that is curious about the bar course, it's meant to be done as many as possible out of the bar course. Not just 3, not just 4, not just 5. No, it's as many as you do, the better for you, right? So you start with copying eyes, then you copy nose and mouth, and then you copy face, half of the face, and then you copy an ear, right? You copy the ear, you still break it down, you see how you get those shapes right, and maybe it's a bit more tonally, and then you get a face, right, without the ear. You get a face, and the face, you start copying and still breaking it down from the construct. Notice how, by the way, this is an important part, getting into the practical aspect. Notice how there is 2 for drawing and 1 for tones, right? There is not like 5 for tones. So this just goes to show how important the linear aspect of this was. How to start, how to begin, how to lay your fundament on which you build on top your tones. So this was the important step, how to get from these general big angles into something small and more specific. So yeah, very, very important for them. So you start with these ones, you copy them, you continue copying to the face, you get something more complex, you got hair, you got an ear, you got a neck, right? You copy these things. Again, everything collides, everything gels, everything builds upon the previous thing. And it continues onwards. Then with the face, you get into hands. You get into the hand, and then hand turns into an arm, and you do the arm. So everything is about like breaking these big outlines into something a little bit more simple, something that you can manage. Now, by the way, another thing is very typical for the bar course is these very, very straight line stuff. Bart did not draw in his free time with these straight lines. It's not very particular for Bart. It's not very particular for anybody. They drew with curves. We draw with curves. So where does the curves come from? And the curves come from the necessity of movement. However, these were meant to be the beginning. These are the training rules of the students. So you have to get a rich structure with which the student can replicate. You can replicate a straight line, right? A curve, it's a little bit hard to hit. So you start with something like this to get to the curvy nature of things. You start without straight lines and you get the curves. Although we balance it very nicely when we have a figure, for example, we begin with by explaining, okay, here's C curve, here's S curve, here's a straight line, and that sort of thing. Where you get a little bit more movement and gesture out of the curve. Straight lines you might get a little bit more stiff. Movement you allow with bit more grace will get into the figure. So then you get feet, then you get legs. Finally, you get some torsos, and then the torso with the head. And then that gets into this guy. So yes, this guy and some other as well. Maybe even draperies, okay, increasing the complexity of the whole thing. But yeah, again, you've already learned how to do the leg, you've already learned how to do the torso and the head. So yes, now everything combines and you get to produce this one. All of these were actually meant to be produced with charcoal and a stump. Okay, so charcoal, stump, and an eraser. So yeah, this guy, okay, so here where I was going to talk about this. But yeah, this is the copy. So this started as the other one that I showed, the pouch drawing, later became the bar, and this is how it began. And later got transformed into this very simplified drawing for the students to copy. But additionally, the course provides also some drawings of masters to copy. So this is another thing that we were supposed to not only copy the antique, But later, in part of your education, you copy masters, you copy other people's work. I mean, the antique is kind of like a master work by its own means, but the master work was already kind of looking like a finished product, like something that you were trying to produce. And by the way, copying, very important one, is how one can learn by themselves. That's why the whole thing is. I mean, we learn by copying. I mean, think of, or mimicking. Think about babies and kids. When they're growing up, they copy the parent. The movements and gestures and manners of speech, that sort of thing, and are copied. We're creatures that learn by copying. That is a trait. So this also goes for art. Why should it be different from when it comes to art? There's a great quote, I believe by Ang, who said something like, a good copy is better than a bad original. So keep that in mind, right? When you're doing stuff. Better to copy, to rely on the copying, rather than trying to produce and squeeze out our work that may not be that up to the level yet. So if you're looking for a way to improve at home, or let's say once you've graduated, copying is a great method of doing that. Now there is also a danger with copying where you can become a really good copyist, but you may not become very good at drawing. So that's the issue. You have to actually be able to extrapolate knowledge from the work you're copying. Students back then they were urged to go to the Louvre. The museum that was right next to. This is something I didn't mention. The academy was in the Louvre. They were next to each other. So when you have a break between your morning session with the atelier and your evening drawing class, you can go to the Louvre, copy something, and then go to your evening class. And this was supposed to be given. Some instructors insisted on the students bringing copies back for critiques from the Louvre. You were expected to do this. Yeah, it was understood. So then this so the course progresses to these figures. You all know that was the little large constructs. They were actually meant to be up to scale, right? The ones we have there framed. This is how the actual size. You copy the side that you're actually going to work in. So that proceeds to that. You've already learned all the previous steps. These are naturalistic in essence, right? These look more like models. The outline is still broken with straight lines for the most time, but now we get to a bit more curves, right? A little bit more movement, a little bit more gesture, a little bit more life into these. And again, more organic, more realistic in essence. So you continue you continue working on these, copying these to include yourself. So you've copied the antique, and then you proceed to this one to now learn how to basically get a figure going. So you start with this one, you start with basic again, and you move to something a little bit more specific later. So yeah, another example. Now let's talk about Julian. I think it's with A. But Bernard Romain Julian. He was older than Charles Barth. He was from the older generations. He's from the generation of the neoclassicists. When the necessity for a course began, yes, Charles Barth was the one who got the commission to produce it, to get it out there. Jerome commissioned Barth, so it came from the top, essentially, that commission. But Julian tried to produce on his own like a course as his own means to get it out there, also to help. However, his course, as we know today, because we almost haven't heard of it, is there was something missing. It was not didn't meet the requirements at the time. It was a little bit outdated, and we will learn why. Yes. So again, the course follows very clear progression. It also starts with, I think here I have some examples. It also starts with copying some of these examples, like of eyes and ears and mouths and heads. But notice how neoclassical this is. Like this is very
cartoony in a way. It's nothing too. At the time, they were already kind of like more naturalistic. And this was kind of very outdated at the time. So it was, it didn't meet the requirements and didn't catch up. Here it was again like, yes, so we start with this to copy faces, you get to those Greek antiques. But when you get to these ones to copy the tones, they were very complex for the students. They were meant to be done in sort of hatching way. The student might get confused. What do I do with this? It's very complex. They were very, very difficult also for the students at the time. Bar being the more simplified one, the one that was more had a better question essentially. So yeah, but clear progression, right? You get your concept, you get your big angles, then you get a little bit closer, a little bit more tight, and then you finally get your tones out, and we get look rendered. Yes, this one is actually from the art book. It talks a little bit about this one as well. So about this course as well. So yes, very complex, very in all its ways, the hair, for example, and yeah, kind of a little bit outdated, to be honest. Here's a direct comparison between the two. You notice how much so the art still gets those big dark shapes for shadows. Here we have a lot more information in the shadows. It's more about just getting those little intricate information in. This is more about getting those big informations in, getting that with the stone later, like kind of turn the form. It's more about drawing like with a line and getting those. Yeah, that's what made this one a little bit more outdated. So, and finally we get to Adolphe Van of the three. And Adolphe Van produced the book. And the book was meant for students, both advanced and beginners. There's the general thing how to get a figure going at the time. So he produced these drawings. I mentioned a few things about him. So he was the main drawing instructor at the time, at the era. So the book begins with, it begins more with these kind of things, but the book follows this clear progression, right? Again, how to start a figure. You start with these big, very broad lines. Here it doesn't show very well, but there's a straight line going from the hip down through the knee and into the ankle to get, for example, this big angle in, and then you get your muscles in. Actually, the line goes like here. But after this, once you started this big, very straight lining aspect, basically breaking it down, and you get to curves a little bit more curvy. And finally, you get your tones right for the figure. It also explains the skeleton and the anatomy to a certain degree. It just shows this blade, just says, this is this muscle, this is that muscle. Yes, very important how to construct these big angles to these things, right? Think about a cylinder and how the features are wrapping around it. Okay, very, very important how to get the top plane of things and how things will shorten to this particular one. Also, what to focus on. He's not focusing initially on that much information here or the eye or where he's looking. He's focusing on the big movements, the big just blockheads. Getting these big information ears and just by suggestions that he's not going to hear the hair out, but just focusing maybe on the big structural lines before getting into the tones. Here as well, focusing on the bottom planes of things, right? Same idea, but getting how we do the features wrap around things and what is in the bottom plane of things. Same here, right? And before we get to here. So, but how do we get a figure going like this one? Okay, how do we get to more, how do we apply to let's say, a figure drawing like this? Figure drawing that is not academic, by the way, this is study for, of course, for this one. Yes, how do we apply it for the figures that we're doing? So, we've all seen some progression of this sort, like, you start with the big first, and see later you get your main angles, and then you get your parallels and the flow through lines and that sort of thing. And There you find like here's all my parallels and things that we were also installed there with the Adobe Font, basically a structure to build a framework that you build your figure on. But how do we begin this? Like, so we see these things, we've seen these countless of times, it's over there in those boards as well. We see this and we're like, okay, this is nice, it's good, maybe it's good for composing, but how does we try to apply it to the figure? Right? There is this this continuity, like, okay, well, I can design this, but the figure looks different. The figure is more depth, right? Like how does the whole shape thing fits into this? There's a lot of complexity when it comes to this. And nobody says it's gonna be easy, but it is possible. Okay, it is possible to combine these things together to try to match it and glue everything together. Now, of course, you might say, well, should it be depending on the design of things, or should it be depending on the shapes of things? I'm confused. Which one is which? Which one should I do? Of course, the shapes we were discussing, like even in the bar course before, there was some shapes we saw. So certainly shapes were important, but then lines were also important. So which one? What should I do? Well, the best answer that I could come up with is, well, it depends. It depends on the complexity of the pose, it depends on the complexity of the shapes, and the difficulty. So meaning that maybe a pose is, let's say there's a lot of foreshortenings, and let's see the pose with a lot of things, might require more shape, looking at matching the shapes, while still allowing maybe for some addition of design of flow-through lines. But some things, some poses allow for a lot of flow-through lines. This is why also some models are called, well, this is a gesture model. This is a good model, right? Because they show the potential in this. Now, with the study with DNT, with the study of the bars, or yes, just studying these principles of movement, of grace, of tranquility, of beauty, of restraint, of these things, in learning how to apply it. So these things, so these lines are meant to bring harmony to the figure. So all these things, how they harmonize together is very important. Now, if one is actively looking for these, they will introduce them in their figures. But one must be actively looking for this information, otherwise it's not going to work. If you're just expecting this to appear on a piece of paper, it's not going to happen. One must be actively looking and chasing after these things. And once you spot them, it's like, oh wow, it's working. Yeah, like, oh, if I continue the arm here, and, oh wow, it continues into the head or something. So very important to keep note of that. So here is, for example, there's an example that I did for this figure on a practical note. So yeah, we all know the placement stage. Afterwards, it's like, yeah, I'm trying to search for these big folds and these big lines that connect everything and bring harmony to things. So I mean the biggest movements on the body, trying to connect head with foot almost. I'm looking, I'm chasing actively after these ones to bring the figure together, to match the extremities and make everything work together. Striking the right chord almost. Continuing that, I'm bringing a bit more complexity with some parallel lines, okay? Looking for some parallel curves that also hit the same note, but they're an extension to it, okay? A modulation of the main chord. And that makes it even more interesting. It just makes it happen, makes it click a little bit better. It's just like everything happens. When you have a good pose, when you have a good angle, good figure, everything is just miraculous, everything works out. But even on a not so good day, let's say, or week, you can find in your figure, if you're actually searching, you say, oh wait, actually this one matches this angle, this one matches that, and I can continue it. But this should be at the back of your mind, because when you spot it, you have to recognize it and immediately implement it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen in your work. So yes, here are the parallels, and then adding additional information with which I bring the gesture in completion. I do believe that gesture is the most important stage, even before construct. Well, it's the foundation, it's the main part. If you get the gesture right, it's much easier then to bring. I just wanted to mention a few things. So what's the importance of gesture, right? When you get the gesture, when we're doing the gesture, it lays the foundation. Once we have the foundation, it's very easy to build construct, right? You get a gestural curve, you add a little bit more to strike the same rhythm. However, if it's very easy, if I don't do that, I might lose it, right? I'm getting different angles. I'm overcomplicating this too much, and my gestural curve is lost. That's why here there's the slash, right? This is not the same as this one. This calls the gesture much better. It keeps everything together, harmonizing it much better. And then, of course, this is applied to something practical, how to get an arm started. You start with something simple, then you break it down, and further break down, and so on and so forth. But it's, yes, you start with the gesture, and if you keep it, it's there. It lays the foundation, again, breaking that complexity down further. Additionally, so this is the difference between gesture completed and construct completed. Much more tightened. Still, we don't like articulation. We'll take care of this looseness and chaotic nature. But for now, it's fine. For construct, it's fine. I've brought the leg in. I've gotten a nice foot here. I've gotten the some shallow shapes in as well. But everything is looking right. This stick now looks like a stick. The pectorals are in, and so on and so forth. Construct completed. Right? I've expanded further, but on the same gesture. I've used the gesture that I related initially to build this. If I wouldn't have been able to, if the gesture was not sufficiently done, I cannot simply produce a good construct. So, well, let's look at some more examples of figure drawings to get a little bit more inspiration. And with this, this should bring us to a close. So, figure drawing, then, yeah, notice these ones, how very well orchestrated this drawing is. It has a lot of these lamps in the background and these people in the background. But the figure is just exquisite. It's very nice. Notice how little information there is in the shadows. Something I keep saying to everyone: soften your shadows, guys. This is what's possible. There is still some information in the shadows, but it's very much subdued. There is most of the information is here in the halftones, even though lights are a little bit bleached. Be careful not to add. This is very tonal. This is the turn of the century, so we're getting very tonal at this point. Very linear. The linear aspects, the linear principles of building this are still there. You can notice this big flowful line, right? How everything is built around it. Nothing is lost. Nothing has gotten in the way of that. It's still there. It's still present. Notice this one, right? It's probably started with something like this, but then with some variation, some variety, it still strikes the same chord, yet it makes it a little bit nicer. It makes it a little bit more active. It's still quite nice to look at. Very, very gestural, very pleasant to look at. This is another one. Same model, by the way. Is it? No. Different model, but the one before of the King Cox drawing. So yeah, they had to reuse a lot of models. This is a funny thing. So most of the models that they got were actually Italian immigrants going to Paris. And it was kind of like a common thing. Everyone of the family would just flock in front of the French Academy, like a piazza or something where they'll go there. And then a representative of the different ateliers would go in and say, "You look good, let's come with me, like you're going to post this week," and the other one select the best one, and that's how they would get. There were models who posed from kids until old age. So that's how much. And also they had kids posing. That's also the case. Different times. So yes. Anyway, this model again, you're noticing these big curves and very nice, very well organized, very well orchestrated drawing. Nothing gets in the way. Nothing sticks out. But everything is just nice. Notice how this big photo right here, or this one in the back. Notice the parallels just happening everywhere, right? Going straight in this angle across. And then this contrapunct contrasting to the major movement. right? Now you can say, well, the model probably, how is the model to this? We don't have the model to compare it against, but I'm pretty sure this arm did move from time to time. I'm pretty sure this knee didn't strike the same thing. Maybe sometimes it was closer to matching the outline, sometimes it's not. They're the same, it's the shape fluctuated. But at the end of the day, it's important that we make a convincing leg, right? Because that's what later Talon will do with our drawings. So whether we rely heavily on shapes or we do our best to get the lines accurate, or some combination of both, which we're trying to do, is what produces this. Nothing is, of course, we're saying the ideal, when we're teaching, we're saying the ideal, how the ideal approach would be. Some poses, some angles might require some more, let's say, to exaggerate certain aspects of it. Whether that's shapes, we have to pay the extra close attention on the shapes, or we have to pay attention to the gesture, because otherwise we might lose it or something like this, right? Everything is just, as I said, depends on the case. But anyway, it's very nice to look at these examples. Notice here, again, the shadows are very soft. Nothing sticks out. Most of the information, again, in the halos and in the lights. Everything is very well balanced, very well designed, and very well drawn to begin with too. Yes, not the design of the hair, by the way. Something else teaching some students. Not the design of the hair, how it's like organized randomness in a way. If you just try to make something random, it will not be random. It's going to look like a chessboard. You're trying to make it so that you deliberately try to make it look random, which is not that easy to actually, as it turns out. So you have to work a bit against yourself to make it work. By the way, also look at the lost edges. Lost edge, found edge. Here's our lost again. Found edge. So yeah, edges, another thing to look for in these works. Casts, very nice examples. To look at also, look at how this, nothing really gets in the way, right? The cast still looks like it looks a white cast. And it doesn't look like a figure, right? It's different, looks different, behaves different. But they've managed to get the correct feeling for it. They've managed to get the correct look for it. Still quite nice. Very, very nice. The drapery is also very, very beautiful, very, very nice. The knees, everything. But of course, this is a cast. Here, notice with this one, very nice. When I first looked at this, I didn't really notice, but then I was thinking, like, how did the model hold these hands? That was very, very interesting. Like, wasn't he getting tired? Like, it's doing this swinging over. Maybe he was holding strings or something, probably. But who knows? In any case, it's a nice example. Most likely there was a string wrapped around his wrist where he was resting against. Probably that was the case. But yeah, again, very nice. But notice also how this gets darker as it moves away, and how this like gets lighter, or it's the lightest, and then again it's a little darker, but this arm is a little lighter than this one, to suggest that the movement across space. Very, very nice. Again, how the light is so light, it bleaches a little bit of these hots, and nothing is too much in the way of showing how intense the light is. So yes, very, very nice example. Notice how soft the hair is also, whenever you have hair. And then again, it progresses, right? You get nice drawings, and then that translates very well into a painting. Once you've done once you're good at drawing, then you are allowed to progress into painting. That's how the academy progressed. You get to that paint. It's not like you do a certain amount of drawing and then you proceed to painting. No, it's when you're good. When you're good, let's paint now. So paintings, again, very, very nice examples of the paintings, and we see the same things that translated into this later translated. Look at the design of the hands, this keeping the gesture, these big flows, is keeping it together. We can kind of see actually the drawing underneath a little bit. we can see the attention to these things and the attempt at preserving these initial gesture lines. And of course, the main study being the one, the portrait and the torso. Another great example, it also, by the way, really not a big name when it comes to these academic drawings. Most of his works were preserved, and they give a really good example of how they were made. Student again of Jerome. So the elbow down and gently ankle. Okay, very nice, very big. And yeah, this one is kind of like even funny a little bit. But notice the attention to like preserving the larger form, the big form of each of these ones. There's something too much getting in the way. This is actually a good example of kind of like paper modeling actually, but it's just funny. I find it funny. And yeah, that one is actually there on the wall. Another by Julian Alden Weir. Again, a big name in these academic drawings. Julian Allen Weir, his drawings got preserved because well, his brother was a how you call that? I think in a college and in America. So his brother was that, and he actually paid Julian to send him some drawings. Well, he gave him money also to buy French art and bring it to the college. And yes, they exchanged a lot of letters where he asked his brother to explain how the French were actually doing these kind of things. So the book is you can find it. It's quite interesting information to read to go through. So yeah, I believe this is the last slide. So yes, and yeah, to just finish with some words is, if drawing has a lot of importance when it comes to this. We saw how the progression, how it went, what tradition, what brought it to be the way it's now. And we saw how we inherit this tradition, how we inherit all this knowledge, and how we're trying to export the same principles to the students here, to you guys. And yeah, I believe that following these ones, actively searching for these things, continuing to copy, continuing to learn, will make you into good artists. Just continue to strive, continue to try to improve. It's going to help you a lot. Okay, that's it.